Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to your Lake Fork Guide. Another episode of the Guides Network. Going to be yours truly, giving it to you today. And I have set a high goal for this video. My goal at the end of this video is that after you watch this, you will have the very best pre-spawn season you've ever had in bass fishing. Some of you might be looking at me like I'm a little crazy. Why are we talking about pre-spawn? We just got into winter, Bill. Like, what are you doing here? Not exactly the case. Down here, Texas, where I live, you know, we have fish that start to spawn around Valentine's Day. Sometimes, a lot of times, often sooner than that, early February. And if they're going to start spawning by no later than Valentine's Day, that means New Year's Day is pretty much the beginning of pre-spawn minimum. Sometimes even earlier than that. So, it might seem off topic, but there will be fish starting to use these pre-spawn patterns here within the next couple weeks. You know, the pre-spawn deal is kind of a complex deal. There's a lot of different types of areas they can use, a lot of different staging points. It's a pretty complex deal to figure out on how to locate these fish. Catching them is not that difficult oftentimes. Sometimes it is, but oftentimes the catching them is not the hard part. It's actually locating these bass during the pre-spawn period that's difficult. So today what we're going to do, I'm going to try to walk you through every scenario that I can think of for pre-spawn success, and we're going to try and show you some examples of those type of areas as we go through the video. And like I said, it's kind of complex, guys. So the first thing that you have to do is not find where you're going to pre-spawn fish. You have to locate where are the bass going to spawn in the biggest numbers on that lake, or where are the biggest fish going to spawn on that lake. You know, if you're local to Lake Fork, then you're going to know Glade, Little Caney, Birch. You know, all these creeks are going to be creeks that are notorious for having spawners and having early spawners. That's a big deal, early spawners. Running Creek's another one of them. Lake Fork Creek, they all spawn early in these north end shallow flat creeks. So that's where you're going to want to start. You got to know where they're going to spawn first and then start backing out from there. Now go to the mouth or the entry point of that area. That's the first place you want to start. And the first thing that I'll look for, where I'll start with my pre-spawn hunt, is going to be creek bends. When I say creek bends, what I'm talking about is the old creek channel before the lake was built. It'll curve around, wind through the old woods back in the day. Well, wherever it made a bend, that water pushed up against that outside bend makes a sharp drop off. When these water temps and weather is changing so much during the pre-spawn period, fish like to be able to move vertically without having to move horizontally. So those sharp drop-offs on those outside bends of the creeks are a big deal. Fish love them, and we will use these creek bends is a big deal for pre-spawn around here, whether it's out in 20 foot with fishing with a jig on a creek bend, or whether you're banging a crankbait or a chatterbait off the edge of it in 3 foot. It doesn't matter. They use creek bends all the way back. They travel down these creeks. Those are like highways, and everywhere there's a big bend, that's a stop sign. That deep transition is something they look for. So the first thing you're going to want to do is out towards the mouth of the creek, start locating your deep creek channel bends. All right, the next thing you're going to want to do is locate the points at the mouth of that creek. Points are another place that fish can stop on as they travel in. Maybe this particular creek doesn't have the sharpest drop off in its creek, so these fish aren't going to travel down the highway of the creek as much because there's not as much of a defined channel. So they'll just travel in and they'll stop on some of these points and secondary points inside the mouth of these creeks. And what I like to do here is I like to put a point system together. So I like to say, okay, I'm at the mouth of a major spawning bay that I know holds a lot of fish. That's 1 point. I found me a creek bend out there. That's 2 points. Wait a minute, that creek bend actually swings up against a secondary point. Okay, that's 3 points. That creek bend that swings up against that secondary point in the mouth of that spawning bay, it has timber on it. That's 4 points. It also has grass on it. That's 5 points. So that's kind of how I like to do my map study. Does it have timber? Does it have grass? Is it a creek bend? Is it a point? Is it in the mouth of the bay? If it's all of the above, you'll get to a maximum of 5 points. Or a dock. A dock can be a point, which a dock and timber to me are kind of the same thing, especially in the cold water temperature of the year when they're not really hunting out shade. A dock is nothing more than standing timber, in my opinion, for the fish. But what you want to do is start counting up these points and create a point system where you know, okay, this is my best pre-spawn area. That's the one I want to go try first. This is my second best, third best. So you kind of rate these areas. Now, one key aspect of this is going to be some homework you have to do. You're going to have to know kind of how far into the pre-spawn are these fish. Is this the very beginning? Are they way out at the mouth of the creek in a 20-foot creek bend off the side of a point? Or have they progressed back to the back of the pockets? Now, I will tell you this. Around here, when we get to January 1st, the first time we have a significant warming trend where that water starts climbing, the backs of those bays and creeks will warm up much faster than the main lake does, and all those fish that are pre-spawn will rush to the back of that creek, and they'll get as far back in there as they can to get in that warmer water. The bait goes back there, and so do the bass. But the same principles still apply. Points, creek bends, grass, timber. If you have all four of those, you've got the jackpot. If you've got 3 of the 4, you got something pretty good. If you got 2, you can probably work with that. That's what you're looking for. That's one other thing too. These aren't like spots. This isn't like one little spot. Sometimes a creek bend can kind of be one little spot. But for the most part, these aren't spots. These are areas that the fish will use and congregate in that I'm looking for. Not a one cast type deal. More of the mouth of this pocket type of deal. But the techniques and tactics are pretty simple, and it just, like I said, depends on what cover is readily available in that area that I'm wanting to fish at that time. So early in the year, like right now, I actually start my pre-spawn hunt in December. That's when I start looking, and I start looking in creek channel bends that bottom out. The bottom of the creek will be anywhere from say 12, 13 foot all the way down to 20 plus foot at times, depending on how cold the water temps are, what the trend is, how cold it's been recently, how much the water temps have dropped. All that can affect how deep I'm fishing during the pre-spawn. But that's my first place that I'm going to look starting right now in the middle of December is going to be these creek bends. And in that situation, I'm going to throw a jig. In a deeper creek bend, a jig is literally the only bait that I fish this time of year. I don't even try nothing else. I have so much faith in it. I know when there's big fish down there, if they're in that creek bend and they're going to bite something, it's going to be a jig. That's just how I feel personally, and that's how I go about it. Now, as we get warming trends, I will transition from fishing those deeper creek bends and move up to shallower creek bends. Once I get the creek bends that bottom out in say 6 to 7 foot, now I'm going to start opening up to other baits. I really like square billed crankbaits banging off the timber alongside the creek channel bends whenever I can. I love to throw a square bill, any type of a deflecting crankbait, a hard bait that bounces off the cover and scatters out to the side when it hits it. I think that's a great way to catch lethargic cold water pre-spawn bass. It gets a reaction, and it gets reaction from really big bass, and that's obviously a big deal as well. Now, once we get on back there, like I said, the creek channel's bottoming out in 6 foot. That means sometimes the flat may only be 1, 2, 3 foot deep. In this situation, or maybe a little deeper, 4 and 5 foot. When I start getting the flats beside the creek that are in say 5 foot or less, so I got my creek bends bottom out in 7, 8 foot. My flat is 5 foot or less, 4 foot, 3 foot. If there is grass present, a chatterbait and a lipless crankbait are 100% my most tried and true, the baits that I believe in the most in that situation. Fishing pre-spawn drains with grass surrounding it, I always reach for a lipless crankbait and a chatterbait. The other thing is once we get back into these shallower flats where the flats outside the creek channel are 1, 2, 3 foot deep, okay, now I'm really going to start to look at the movement ADX. That bait has always, since the first year I've owned it, done a phenomenal job for me in the cold water of getting big bites out of reaction from bouncing off cover. So if I can fish, the grass isn't too thick, and I can fish a movement ADX, that's a shallow diving crankbait from 6 Sense Fishing. It only dives about 2 foot deep at the most. That sounds crazy to fish in 50-something degree water, but it works. We catch big ones on it every year, the cold time of year. So that's another bait that I have in my arsenal ready to go. But in all of these situations, if you're paying attention, you'll notice the bait I'm fishing is really dictated by the cover that's present in a given area. So if I'm fishing a creek bend, the cover that's there is a ledge, a drop off, and a bunch of standing timber with root systems in the bottom of it. That's going to be my jig areas. As I get shallower and I can fish square lip crankbaits that'll deflect off there, I'll start reaching for that. I want to bounce that off the wood. Again, with the jig, with the crankbait, I'm contacting the wood, I'm getting deflections off cover, a jig's hopping over and falling real fast. Like, these are reaction bites that we're going for. It's not like I'm throwing out there and dragging a Cinco around looking for, begging for a bite. That can work on a warming trend, but that's a whole nother topic. We'll talk about that a little later in the pre-spawn. We'll save that for another video. And then as we get shallower, if grass starts to become present, that's when we reach for the baits that work really well in grass getting reaction bites. Lipless crankbaits, chatterbaits, contacting the grass, rip them out. The one thing that's in common with all of this, I'm fishing baits that will fish the cover present efficiently, and I'm fishing baits that will get reaction bites by sudden changes in direction. Whether it's the jig hopping over a root, whether it's the square bill bouncing off the stump, or the lipless crankbait and chatterbait pausing on the grass and jerking out, It's sudden change in direction causes these reaction from these big lethargic pre-spawn bass that are still cold. Still cold water, they're still cold. Sometimes on the warming trend they will fool you and think it's not cold, but most days you're going to have to make these fish bite. They're not going to want to bite. You know, a couple other baits that can work really well at times during this pre-spawn period. One is going to be a jerkbait, and you can fish the jerkbait according to the depth of water you're fishing, but suspending jerkbaits will work extremely well during a pre-spawn period. And also an old spinnerbait with big blades. A big bladed spinnerbait that vibrates a lot can sometimes be the absolute ticket. That's going to fall into play the same places that I usually want to throw my lipless crankbaits and my chatterbaits. And you guys know, for all my hard baits, whether it's going to be my lipless crankbaits, I love my favorite lipless crankbait in the pre-spawn period is the Quake 70, the old school with the BBs. I do throw the one knocker some, but I find myself throwing the regular Quake 70 more often than the Thud, which is the one knocker version. The Movement 80X from 6 Sense Fishing, phenomenal bait like we talked about. The jig I throw is the hybrid jig from 6 Sense Fishing. The best jig I've ever thrown, with the combination of getting in and out of heavy cover and hooking the fish correctly in the top of the head most of the time. All of those baits you can find at 6sensefishing.com. If you go over there and place an order, please punch in the code Your Lake Fork Guide. That'll get you a 10% discount. Our little way of saying thank you to each and every one of you guys. Really appreciate everything y'all do, the support y'all give us here at Your Lake Fork Guide. So in recap, start at the mouths of the spawning areas. Find the most popular spawning areas where most of the fish typically spawn in that lake. Find the structure at the mouth of it, be it creek bends and points. Then find the cover, timber and grass. And then fish the baits that work efficiently in the cover that's present on that area. I like to start out at the mouth and work my way in. If I'm new to a body of water and I've never fished there, I'm always going to try to find the good stuff out at the mouth and work my way back first. Just kind of crossing it off the list, see how far back they've come. The only time I would make it, the only time I would make an exception to that would be if I've had a major warming trend, a fairly significant warming trend for 3 or 4 days where the water temps have been climbing. Then I'm going to start in the very back and work my way out, because it's likely, to me, in my opinion, it's more likely those fish could be all the way back, as far back as they can get, because that shallow water has been warming up. The other thing you need to remember, don't forget this part, this is important. Those flatter areas, those areas that have really big expanses of shallow water will always warm up first, and the fish will always spawn there first. So those are the type of areas you're going to want to pre-spawn out in front of those areas before you pre-spawn in some of the creeks and bays and pockets that have steeper banks or deeper water further back in them. Those areas are going to tend to warm up later in the season, and the good thing is you can fish pre-spawn patterns starting in January 1st, and you can still be fishing them in April. If you really key into this and really get efficient at it and get good at it, this is a pattern that can last you a quarter to a third of the year, depending on how fast the weather progresses. And it can absolutely, it does absolutely, for me personally, kicks out the biggest bags of the year just about every year come on the pre-spawn patterns. All right guys, thank y'all so much for watching today, man. I sincerely, like I said, I hope after watching this video that this was a lot. I know it was a lot to take in, a lot to digest, but I hope all this information, I hope you're able to put it to practical application, make it work for you, and I sincerely hope that you guys have the best pre-spawn period that you've ever had. Those are awful lofty goals there. I hope that's not coming across as being arrogant, because I'm certainly not. I'm very, very honored and blessed to be able to do what I do every day, and I just want to share as much of it as I can, and that's the knowledge that I have from fishing a lot of years of pre-spawn on Lake Fork and all these lakes in Northeast Texas. That's my synopsis on how we've come to do it. So hey guys, thanks one more time for watching, and we'll see you next time right here on Your Lake Fork Guide.